Okay, guys, so we're looking at the opening of Act 2, Scene 1, and eventually the discussion questions that we'll be focusing on. But first of all, we want to look at the reflection on the performance that takes place after they've all been singing. There's a very deliberate sort of backstaged improvisational feel about the opening of this scene as they applauding each other and saying bravo, well done, magnificent. There's a knock on the door, right, stage manager with tray and coffee handed to Constable. So in this stage direction here, we are given the impression that we are backstage. And this is another one of those Brechtian moments of a fourth wall violation almost. And so the maniac here says, excellent. So here we are, and our suspect is in the best of moods. He's never been happier. He's ecstatic. Coffee, gentlemen. So at this point in the story, we've got a suggestion of the improvisational nature of the police testimony because it's being discussed in the present tense. It's as if it's happening right now, and there is an improvisational sort of narrative quality to what's going on. Further down the page, the superintendent says the crossfire of false accusations hasn't in the least upset his mental state. No raptus, not a whisper of stress. All that is much later, at midnight. And so here, again, this undermines their previous story because it's a complete revision of that definition that they had so painstakingly tried to construct with the maniac earlier on in the play. There's no raptus. And what we've got then is this complete sense of the truth being malleable and layered in versions of events as we go throughout the play. They start now to discuss the nighttime scene. They say, and now it's midnight. And the maniac orders them to set the scene. And the constable says, it's midnight. And the maniac goes, woo, woo, and makes an owl noise. And the others help to create midnight atmosphere. But the way that this sort of woeful Brechtian effect emphasizes the farcical nature of their earlier revision is meant to be deliberately ironic, that we've got this story that taps into their earlier revision about it being after it's midnight, and that's an important detail in their earlier revision. But this pathetic scene setting that they attempt to do, which is like the worst sound effects that you could ever conjure, deliberately gives us this impression here of the unreliable nature of the story that it supposedly is telling. The first question over the page on page 40 is about the middle of page 40 and what is distinctive about Pisani's attempt to exonerate himself and the police from accusations of clandestine violence. Now, here, the maniac is trying to suggest that they relax a little bit. The shoulders are full of cramps. The constable says, he's massaging the constable, and then suddenly says towards the end, after all these hours then, sudden karate chop, and the maniac karate chops the constable on the back of the neck, and Pisani's annoyed here. And so he says, there was no violence, no massage, no karate, nothing like that. It was all above board, according to regulations. We were conducting our inquiries in a very light-hearted manner. You were interrogating him, light-heartedly. We were having a bit of a laugh with him, playing grandmother's footsteps, were you? Paper hats, stick the tail on the donkey. It was just the odd joke, Your Honour. You should see the inspector when he's on form. Keeps us all in stitches. Ha ha! Especially when interrogating mass murder suspects. So, within this passage here, there is a complete reversal of the dynamic that we've seen previously, in the sense that where they now are sort of attempting to avoid accusations of violence by deliberately seeming light-hearted and playful. And so this, again, emphasizes the sort of farcical nature of what's going on in this passage. And then the maniac turns on them at the end. He becomes serious. And what the effect of this is to emphasize a sense of gross negligence on their part, as if they're light-heartedly dealing with serious criminals. And so whichever way they turn, the maniac manages to corrode their sense of professional integrity. That if they're being violent, he manages to make them seem brutal. If they're being ridiculously light-hearted. He manages to make them seem negligent. And then the maniac at the bottom says, "So you're a bit of a wag, Inspector," and then orders him to take the stage. And so within this, there's a kind of role reversal that's exploited throughout the scene where, up until the journalist's entry, the police interrogation becomes this deliberately farcical performance. The fact that Pisani tells jokes and takes applause, but without us hearing any of them, gives us this sense of him in this kind of crass, pathetic performance. The second question is about how the maniac uses irony in his lines on page 41 to reveal the implications of police brutality. There's this long passage here where the maniac poses as a naïve, which is a sort of singular naive individual. He poses in a state of naivety when he talks about his experience in Bergamo, listening to people being beaten up and pretending that he believed naively that this was some form of comedy that he was discussing here. He says, "Naturally, I assumed, as any citizen who reads the papers and watches TV would, that those were the sounds of suspects being beaten under interrogation by brutal country coppers. All too clearly now I can see how mistaken my impressions were. Those shrieks I heard were shrieks of laughter. The screams were screams of merriment and mirth, accompanied by thigh-slapping convulsions of humorous hysteria." And so at this point here, his adopted false naivety actually exposes the brutality of the police interrogation tactics. So here, where he pretends now, he takes the lead and suggests that their interrogations are light-hearted and gentle, but adopts this pose of naivety to deliberately reveal, ironically, how their interrogation tactics are anything but. And then in the bottom half of the page, the third question asks us about his self-brutalization towards the bottom half of page 41. How does this stand in contrast to the principles of self-preservation followed by the police during the investigation? So we look at this passage here, and there's a strong pattern of jarring language here. Wacky, witty carabinieri, he calls them, what jokers sending their suspects spinning across the floor in fits of fun, smashing their heads on the tiles at side-splitting japes. So these phrases that he uses here often quite disturbingly combine acts of violence with comedy. You know, if something is wacky, it can be kind of zany and crazy and a bit weird, but it also can contain the word whack, an echo of the word whack, which is a violent hit. And then fits of fun, you know, as if a fit is this act of painful violence combined with fun. And side-splitting japes, as if you laugh so hard your sides have split. But again, it contains within it the suggestion of violence. And so we have this jarring combination of the violent and the comic in this wordplay. And the three policemen join in with this act in the end of this. But importantly, the maniac also hits himself really hard with an imaginary blow in the stomach. And so there's this physical performance of his violence that is at odds with what he's saying, you know, as if it's just this joke, and then smashing himself in the stomach. So again, his actions sort of speak louder than the words about the truth here. And in many ways also his self-mortification and brutalization, his harming of himself, stands in stark contrast to the sort of strategy of self-preservation that all of the rest of the police follow. The next question is at the top of page 43, and it asks us about the maniac's lines here and how they exploit different moods and structures of sentence to create a juxtaposition of farcical and serious tones. So we look at this line, and it's talking about the anarchist supposedly being able to leap out of the window, and because he's found in a position that suggests he hasn't fallen directly out the window, he's in some way been either pushed or has jumped quite a way. And the maniac is contesting this. But first of all, he says, fine, all right, but here was a man of 5'4", give or take an inch, on his own, without stepladder, spring accomplice, trampoline, brine iron lope with crampons attached, or any other device he manages to get from there, indicates chair, indicates window, to here, and within 3 seconds he becomes jam sponge, and there's 4 highly trained policemen just standing there. Look at the room, gentlemen. Surely one of you must have been in the vicinity of the window. So this sentence that he uses here is made of this list of items that would have to in some way be, they begin at the most and end at the least plausible possible items to have been used to launch the anarchist out of the window. A stepladder, a spring, an accomplice, a trampoline, and then here the devices you might use to do climbing or abseiling. And so this list of these short subordinate clauses gives us this proliferating sense of complicating factors and of the farcical nature of this possible explanation. And then we have this final euphemistic metaphor of the body as jam sponge, and then the highly trained policeman just standing there at the end of this sentence in a highly climactic fashion that critiques their passivity in the face of all of this energy and dynamism in the rest of the sentence. The fifth question asks us how the sense of security created by the maniac towards the bottom of page 43 undermines the intelligence of the police. So what we have here is this argument about the shoe. The constable says, he was very athletic, very fast. I only just managed to grab him by the foot. Aha, my tenacity pays off, you see. You grabbed him by the foot? Yes, but his shoe just came off in my hand. And the maniac pretends to be really excited about this. That's it. Brilliant. Why didn't I see it before? The vital thing was you had the shoe in your hand. Incontrovertible proof of your evidence to save the suspect. You've done it, gentlemen. Well done, constable. Then they slowly twig they're in the clear. And twig here means that they slowly work out and connect the dots and work out that they are free if this explanation holds. Of course it works. Well done, constable. They then, within 2 lines, are taking drinks from the filing cabinet, applauding and shaking the constable's hand. Now, the first thing to say is that the fact that it takes quite a while to realise that this detail could be used to support evidence, ironically kind of exposes its fictionality. The fact that it takes them ages to work out that this evidence could be used to defend themselves exposes its own weakness as a defense, and also the fact that it isn't real. They haven't thought about it already, and they've tried to think of everything. And so they seem stupid, the evidence seems weak, but then within 2 lines, they're celebrating this, and they're completely given a sense of getting away with this scot-free. So here we have this gradual exposure of their stupidity through the actual way that they process this information and their sudden transformation to a sense of ecstatic happiness. Then the maniac, realizing that we have this ludicrous sense of satisfaction, exploits this with legal language of a sort of performed sense of seriousness, of faux seriousness. The maniac says, was the suspect a triped, superintendent? And he uses this sort of Latinate description to describe it, as if he has 3 legs. That's what it means, 3 legs and feet. And he says, I beg your pardon. And then further on down in his lines, he said, but according to this addendum on page 16, 4 witnesses in the courtyard below, including a reporter from the Corriere della Sera, swear the jam sponge was accoutred with a pair of shoes consistent with the average biped, i.e., the body smashed to pieces on the floor was wearing a pair of shoes because he had 2 legs. And so here he ironically exposes the ludicrous nature of their story, that he has 2 legs and 2 feet and 2 shoes on. So where you've got this idea that having a shoe in your hand somehow exposes you, somehow exonerates you from blame is ridiculous. But he uses this very severe faux seriousness legal language to, I think, draw attention to the ridiculousness of the content that he's discussing. If you deal with stupid ideas in quite fancy, serious language, then there's this great sense then of them being in some way ludicrous and jarring. Question 7 then asks about the interaction between Pisani and the maniac, creating an elevating sense of farce and hysteria on the second half of the page. So it begins here with the superintendent saying, well, that's a funny business. Maniac says, to be sure, don't know how that happened. Unless the constable here, moving like the clappers, had time to belt down to the balcony a few floors below, lean out and slip the suspect's shoe back on as he came sailing by. And he deliberately voices a kind of exaggerated and logically impossible story to expose the police. But then Pisani says Jesus, criticizing this explanation, saying it's ridiculous. And he challenges him to find a plausible explanation. And then within one stage is engaged in this act of fabrication himself. Very well. Obviously, one of the suspect's shoes must have been too big for him. So not having an insole to hand, he had previously put a smaller shoe on inside the bigger one, which came off in the constable's hand. Or one foot was considerably smaller than the other, and the same means was employed to even up the feet for cosmetic reasons. Pisani looks manically triumphant. So we look at this Pisani's exchange as being even more farcical than the maniac's. So here, it functions almost like a kind of creative challenge here for Pisani to engage in this fanciful plot construction. And so again, we have the sense that this interrogation is in some way performative and ludicrous. At the bottom, Pisani seems manically triumphant, and he's been in some way duped into the maniac's sort of brand of creativity here. He seems like the maniac. He is manic, and he's pleased with himself because he's been engaged in improvised storytelling. And so again, that idea of a role reversal here gives us the sense of Pisani having been tricked into this and being exposed as fabricating truths out of thin air. The maniac then sits back to enjoy the scene, which gives us as a sense of his satisfaction with the exposure of their talent, and I've put it very deliberately in speech marks because it's a talent for the ridiculous. And this is a sort of ironic contrast to a sort of proud teacher or coach, as if he's able now to just sit back and let them take control of this ludicrous situation because they're now carrying out these fabrications themselves without his intervention. Question 8 then asks us about the superintendent's shift into a different role, which he does in the exchanges on page 45. And we think about how his interrogation's dynamic has shifted, and how does the action on page 45 explain why the maniac is described in the stage direction at the bottom of 44, sitting back to enjoy the scene. So we see in this passage, it's worth rereading these lines just to see this, because the superintendent is angry. He says, precisely, it's not as mad as it sounds, sir, and he just says it's fucking deranged. There's no mention in the autopsy of abnormally disproportioned feet. That's not the point I'm pursuing. I'm saying that what I held in my hand may, in fact, have been a galoche, a kind of Wellington boot, a rubber boot. Nobody wears galoshes these days. Anyway, it wasn't raining. But the anarchist may have thought it was about to. Galoshes are a ridiculous garment. An anarchist wouldn't be seen dead in them. Exactly. Bloody balls, constable. I'm only trying to help. Cock. Complete cock. Anarchists are often very eccentric. He may have been wearing galoshes. Well, where are they? Where are the fucking galoshes? Not in the transcript. Not amongst the dead man's possessions. The shoe he had in his hand was a shoe. He runs to a cardboard box, empties the dead man's possessions on the floor. This shoe, which you secretly put there after we'd first given up the evidence. Shh! I will not shush. Look. There is a little tag. Item 99B1 shoe, not galosh. Pinhead. Whose writing is this? So within these exchanges here, the important thing to bear in mind is that the police now turn on each other. And because the farce is too extreme. Their own fabrications are too extreme for them to believe in, particularly for the superintendent. So their own lines of inauthenticity are unraveling here as the superintendent exposes this illusory deception that they've created and the lies that they've been subject to. And he reveals the cover-up that they've engaged in previously, that they've planted evidence on the scene in order to tell the story. And so when we think then about why the maniac's sitting there enjoying the scene, is because the superintendent has adopted his role as the person prompting and probing for the truth as they deliberately expose them, or not deliberately, but as they actively expose themselves without any of his intervention. So it's as if he's taught them to do this through his own elaborate performances and verbal dynamism. So he has completely got the better of them here. and they are quite literally taking themselves apart.